There are expressions that, at first hearing, may sound harmless or even affectionate, but hidden behind those words can lie manipulative intent, emotional avoidance, and a quiet refusal to take responsibility for personal growth. When a woman overlooks these signals, she may slowly find herself pulled into relationships that drain her emotional energy, blur her judgment, and weaken her connection with her own inner strength. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and thinker, introduced the concept of the shadow unconscious, describing it as the part of the psyche where we push down traits we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, only for them to reappear later through projection onto others. In relationships, this hidden layer often becomes the breeding ground for repeated toxic cycles. That is why recognizing early verbal patterns is not just helpful, but essential to protect yourself from long-term emotional harm. In this video, I will guide you through 5 common phrases that, if spoken by a man, should immediately raise your awareness. Because this is not about simple misunderstandings or everyday disagreements. It is about realizing that sometimes, behind ordinary conversations, there can be subtle psychological dynamics at play that quietly erode your peace of mind and emotional stability. Seneca once reminded us that it is not that life is short, but that we waste so much of it, often on the wrong people and the wrong attachments. And this becomes even more relevant when we give our time and emotions to those who do not value growth or accountability. Pay close attention, because each of these expressions carries a deeper psychological meaning. Ignoring them can slowly lead you into a draining dynamic where your focus weakens, your self-worth declines, and your connection with your authentic self becomes distant. No woman who has worked on her discipline, self-respect, and emotional balance should normalize such patterns. Stay until the end, because beyond identifying these phrases, you will also understand how to respond with clarity, emotional intelligence, and inner control. Let's begin. When someone says, "You have to accept me as I am," it can initially sound like honesty, authenticity, or even emotional openness. But in reality, context matters deeply. When this phrase is used to justify harmful behavior or avoid self-reflection, it becomes a major red flag. Carl Jung emphasized that self-awareness is the beginning of wisdom, but real transformation only happens when a person stops excusing their limitations and starts integrating their shadow instead of hiding behind it. When a man repeatedly hides behind, "That's just how I am," what you are often witnessing is not authenticity, but resistance to growth. This phrase typically appears after problematic behavior has already shown itself. Emotional inconsistency, avoidance of responsibility, passive aggression, or a lack of accountability. And when confronted, instead of reflection, there is often deflection, victim-like responses, or subtle blame shifting. The truth is simple. Accepting someone does not mean accepting behavior that harms you. Authenticity is not stagnation. It is evolution. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor and philosopher, emphasized living with discipline, awareness, and integrity each day, as though time is precious and not to be wasted in denial or self-indulgence. A conscious and self-aware woman should not carry the emotional weight of someone unwilling to improve themselves. Being in such a dynamic is like trying to move forward while dragging an anchor that refuses to lift. Over time, you are the one adjusting, compromising, and emotionally compensating, while the other person remains unchanged. And what begins as patience slowly turns into exhaustion. Remember, your environment shapes your mindset. If the person closest to you resists growth, they do not remain neutral in your life. They actively slow your evolution. So when you hear this phrase, look beyond the surface. Ask yourself whether there is genuine willingness to improve, or simply a polished excuse to avoid accountability. Because patterns rarely stay the same, they usually intensify. What begins as subtle resistance to change often grows into a consistent cycle of avoidance, denial, and emotional immaturity. And once that pattern is established, it affects everything: communication, trust, emotional safety, and long-term stability. Sooner or later, you may find yourself in a relationship where you are constantly adapting while your needs remain unmet. Protecting your peace is not selfish. It is emotional responsibility toward yourself. You are not meant to fix someone who refuses to take ownership of their behavior. You are meant to build a life with someone who is equally committed to growth. Another common expression is when a man says, "All my exes were crazy, toxic." At first, it may sound like he is simply describing past pain or venting frustration. But beneath this narrative often lies something deeper: a lack of accountability, emotional immaturity, and repeated projection. Stoic philosophy teaches that true wisdom begins with self-examination. Epictetus emphasized that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but how we interpret them. So when someone consistently portrays every past partner as the problem, it raises an important question. Where is their own reflection in the story? Carl Jung also explained that what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves does not disappear, it gets projected outward. In this case, blaming every ex can often be a way of avoiding inner responsibility. It creates a comfortable narrative where the person is always the victim, never the contributor to conflict. This mindset is dangerous because it reveals a repeating psychological pattern: lack of accountability, emotional deflection, and refusal to grow from past experiences. And over time, this pattern does not remain in the past. It repeats itself in new relationships. The real question is not whether all his exes were truly the problem, but whether he has ever taken honest responsibility for his role in any relationship breakdown. A self-aware person reflects, learns, and grows. A stagnant one repeats the same story with different names. Being with someone who avoids responsibility is like building emotional security on unstable ground. No matter how much effort you invest, the foundation remains weak. Eventually, the same narrative that was used to describe the past begins to include the present. And this is where emotional clarity becomes essential. You must observe behavior, not just words. Does he ever acknowledge his mistakes, or is the entire emotional history one-sided? That answer reveals far more than any romantic statement ever could, because it is not your role to act as someone's emotional repair system. You are not meant to heal what another person refuses to face. You are meant to share life with someone who is already walking the path of growth, not someone who expects you to carry them through it. And then there is another phrase that often appears in the early stages of emotional manipulation. If you really loved me, you would do what I ask. At first glance, it may sound like emotional closeness or a request for reassurance, but in reality, it is a subtle form of emotional pressure. This is where love starts being replaced with obligation. Instead of mutual respect, there is conditional approval. Instead of understanding, there is control disguised as affection. Over time, this creates emotional confusion, where saying no feels like rejection, and setting boundaries feels like guilt. True love does not demand compliance as proof of affection. It does not turn care into control, or transform disagreement into punishment. Healthy emotional connection allows space for choice, individuality, and respect without manipulation. When emotional language begins to shift into pressure or guilt, it is no longer just communication. It becomes influence over your emotional decisions. And that is where awareness becomes your strongest protection. Because once you start equating love with obedience, you slowly lose your ability to differentiate between genuine care and emotional control. At first glance, it might look like a sincere request, a way of expressing emotional needs. But if you observe it more deeply, what is actually hidden beneath is a subtle form of manipulative pressure, where your sense of love is being used as leverage to gain control. The Stoics taught that genuine love can never be forced. It has to be freely chosen. It must rest on freedom, mutual respect, and authentic admiration, not on guilt, fear, or emotional coercion. Epictetus said, "No one can enslave you emotionally unless you allow it." And this kind of phrase is designed exactly to blur that boundary, turning affection into a quiet instrument of control. Carl Jung also discussed this psychological dynamic in terms of power and projection. In his work on the shadow, he explained how imbalanced relationships often start when one person unconsciously projects their insecurity and need for dominance under the disguise of love. And statements like this become a clear example of that pattern. When a man says something like this to you, He is essentially drawing an invisible emotional line that conditions your affection. It quietly implies, only if you comply with what I want are you deserving of my love. That is not love in its true sense. It is emotional manipulation wearing the mask of care. An emotionally mature woman needs the awareness to distinguish between a healthy request and a disguised demand. Because agreeing to this kind of emotional pressure might feel like an act of love in the moment, but over time, it slowly strips away parts of your identity, your authenticity, your boundaries, and your inner strength. The most dangerous aspect is that the more you comply, the more the expectations expand. At first, it appears as a simple test of affection. Then it becomes a repeated pattern of emotional compliance, until eventually you can no longer tell whether you are acting out of love or out of fear of losing him. These types of phrases do not build real relationships. Instead, they gradually erode them from within. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where someone makes you feel guilty for having boundaries, for protecting your time, your voice, or your perspective, pause for a moment. You are likely dealing with someone who confuses love with possession. You are not here to sacrifice yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. You are here to grow, to express yourself fully, and to exist in a relationship where your identity is not conditional. When a man says, "If you really loved me, you would do what I ask," he is not simply questioning your feelings. He is indirectly challenging your character and your integrity. This statement is not seeking understanding or emotional connection. It is seeking control. It becomes a disguised attempt to override your will using guilt, while slowly erasing your personal boundaries to impose his own desires. Carl Jung emphasized that real love is never possessive and never manipulative. It is a conscious expression of shared freedom between two individuals. Stoic philosophy reinforces this same truth by teaching that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, not emotional submission. When love is turned into a tool for emotional blackmail, it stops being love altogether. It becomes power disguised as tenderness. Giving in to this kind of emotional pressure does not only weaken your self-discipline, it also creates deep cracks in your self-esteem over time. A woman who has done inner work, who understands her value, and who respects her own truth, should never betray herself just to avoid temporary conflict. Because every time you say yes to something you internally reject, you move further away from your authentic self. And the most dangerous part is that once you allow it, even once, the pattern tends to repeat itself. At first, it starts as a small emotional request. Then it gradually turns into a stronger expectation. And before you realize it, you find yourself living according to someone else's emotional demands rather than your own inner guidance. The response, as both Stoic thinkers and Jungian psychology would suggest, is simple but powerful. Remain centered in your own values. Act according to your principles, not according to the shifting demands of someone who does not respect your boundaries. Because a person who truly loves you does not need to emotionally pressure you into agreement. They communicate, they listen, and even in disagreement, they respect your right to choose. It is always healthier to face a difficult but honest conversation than to live in silent, emotional surrender where your freedom slowly disappears. You do not need to over-explain yourself or justify your boundaries when faced with guilt disguised as love. A wise woman understands that not every emotional battle deserves her energy, especially the ones designed to break her will instead of understanding her truth. And when we go deeper into emotional manipulation, there is another phrase that is even more corrosive, more subtle, yet deeply damaging. You are not enough for me. Hearing these words from someone who claims to love you can feel devastating. It does not only hurt emotionally, it targets your sense of self-worth at its core. It is not just a criticism, it is an attempt to dismantle your identity and make you question your value. Carl Jung explained that people often project their inner dissatisfaction onto others, and this statement is a direct reflection of that mechanism. When a man says you are not enough, he is not truly describing you. He is revealing his own emptiness, his unrealistic expectations, and his internal need for control. He tries to shrink your self-image so that you become dependent on his validation. Stoic philosophy reminds us that our worth is never determined by external judgment, but by our character, our actions, and our inner alignment. Marcus Aurelius made this clear when he taught, "Do not allow another man's soul to govern yours." And that is exactly what this phrase attempts to do. It tries to govern you through insecurity. Someone who constantly compares, criticizes, or implies that you are insufficient is not encouraging growth out of love. Instead, he is pushing you into a cycle where you feel obligated to earn approval that keeps shifting endlessly. In this dynamic, the goalpost is never stable. One day you are not enough for one reason, the next day for another, and eventually you find yourself emotionally drained, questioning things you once knew with certainty. A conscious and self-aware woman does not beg for love, nor does she measure her worth through someone else's unstable perception. You are not here to fit into constantly changing emotional expectations. You are here to share your life with someone who recognizes your value as you are, while also encouraging your growth without breaking your self-esteem. So whenever you hear this kind of statement, pause, breathe, and reconnect with your inner clarity. Do not fall into the illusion that you must become more just to be accepted by someone who fails to see your existing worth. That insecurity does not belong to you. It belongs to him. As Jung once said, you cannot make someone see your light if they are only searching for darkness within themselves. And as Stoic wisdom reminds us, your inner peace is far more valuable than any attempt to reshape yourself for external approval. External validation is unstable, temporary, and often self-serving. True confidence is formed when a woman learns to trust herself, validate her own existence, and stay aligned with her values, regardless of outside opinion. There is no greater mistake than allowing someone, especially someone who uses emotional insecurity as leverage, to define your worth. When a man says you are not enough for him, he is not delivering truth. He is projecting his own internal confusion, ego imbalance, and need for dominance. This statement is not about clarity, it is about control. Carl Jung also explained that what remains unconscious eventually shapes our destiny. And if these emotional patterns are not recognized early, you may gradually find yourself trapped in a cycle where you are constantly trying to prove your worth to someone who has no intention of acknowledging it. In that struggle, you slowly lose sight of who you are. The Stoics also emphasized a powerful truth. No external opinion can have power over you unless you consciously grant it permission.